Hi readers, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be unpacking the story of Their Eyes Were Watching God. In my last video, I gave you some background on Zora Neale Hurston's life, information that might help you prepare to read Their Eyes Were Watching God. And now that you've read it, I'm going to give you a brief thought summary and walk you through some of the major themes and ways that people have read Their Eyes Were Watching God in the past. So, let's dive in. Zora Neale Hurston writes her dialogue in African American vernacular English, as I mentioned in my last video. So don't be ashamed if you had a hard time reading portions of the book. Her use of African American vernacular English is especially significant because it shows how languages evolve. So African American vernacular English today is typically used in urban populations, but Hurston shows the rural southern roots of this dialect. Reading in a new vernacular is a lot like having a conversation with someone with a really thick accent. It takes time, concentration, and practice to get the hang of it and to be able to understand what's going on. Their Eyes Were Watching God begins with Janie Crawford's dirty, shoeless return to the all-black town of Eatonville. Her friend Phoebe stops by to offer her some comfort and friendly company. Janie begins to tell her life story, explaining to Phoebe that "I don't mean to bother with telling him nothing, Phoebe. 'Tain't worth the trouble. You tell him what I says if he wants to. That's just the same as me, 'cause my tongue is in my friend's mouth." Janie explains how when she was a young girl being raised by her grandmother, she began feeling a desire for love, marriage, companionship while looking up at a pear tree. She was struck by the love embrace and ecstatic shiver of the tree from root to tiniest branch as a bee landed in one of the flowers. Janie's grandmother worries about Janie's security after she finds Janie kissing a strange man when Janie's caught in this kind of dream of love. And she tells Janie that she must marry old, wealthy Logan Killix. Janie's grandmother and mother were both raped, and the grandmother sees Logan Killix as a promise of protection for young Janie. Janie doesn't love Logan, but she takes a lot of comfort in knowing that all the married people she knows are in love. That's how she sees it in her young mind. But the love never comes. Janie is disgusted by everything Logan does. She hates his face, she hates his smell, she hates everything about him, and she's miserable. One day, Joe Starks, a charismatic and ambitious man, still quite a bit older than Janie, sees her working at home. Janie is instantly attracted to Joe's confidence, his grand vision of the future, and the opportunity to escape from the repulsive Logan Killix. After a couple of weeks of seeing each other, Janie runs away with Joe to new and broader horizons. Janie and her new husband travel to the all-black town of Eatonville, based on the real-life town where Hurston spent her childhood. Joe hopes that there he can be an influential and important man. He makes Eatonville the first Black-governed incorporated town. Joe quickly becomes mayor, postmaster, landowner, general store manager, and general big shot in Eatonville. Janie, however, is dissatisfied with her life there. Joe keeps her on a pedestal and tries to separate her from the other women, keeping her from building any kind of friendships or companionship or being involved in the vibrant social life of the town. The tensions between them and Janie's general dissatisfaction with working in the general store all the time causes deep rifts in their relationship. After 2 decades, Janie breaks, insulting Joe in front of the town, and Joe beats her. They live separate lives until Joe, who's slowly becoming sicker and sicker, finally dies as Janie berates him, complaining that "my own mind had to be squeezed and crowded out to make room for yours in me." Janie feels freer after Joe's death. She isn't interested in the advances of the many men who were hoping to woo a wealthy, young, attractive widow. She's finally able to develop friends with some of the local women, notably Phoebe, who she's telling this story to. One day, a young man nicknamed Tea Cake, over a decade younger than Janie, who's now in her mid-30s, comes into her store. Janie feels an instant connection to Tea Cake, who treats her kindly and teaches her to play checkers and to shoot a gun. Only 9 months after Joe's death, Janie and Tea Cake marry and leave town, selling the general store and heading north to Jacksonville, Florida. Janie is struggling to trust Tea Cake, afraid that he's a young man just marrying her for her money. She becomes especially concerned when she wakes up one morning to find Tea Cake gone, along with all her money. Late in the evening, Tea Cake returns, apologizing for his weakness and explaining that he used the money to throw a community party with music and food. He promises Janie that she will get her money back. From now on, Tea Cake promises to take care of everything, and he does. Janie feels intensely connected with him, and it's a very strong moment for their relationship. Janie and Tea Cake then move out to the Everglades, where they enjoy life together, harvesting beans through the fall and resting during the summer off-season. Their shack becomes the center of social life on the Everglades, where other harvesters come to gamble, sing, and chat together. 2 years go by, and Janie and Tea Cake are still making good money and good friends in the Everglades. When they hear there's a hurricane coming, they don't believe it, choosing instead to stay home and wait it out. But as the rain keeps falling and the wind begins to pick up, Janie and Tea Cake realize they can't stay in their flooded shack. They begin walking, hoping to flee the rising water. A rabid dog attacks Janie, but Tea Cake protects her, getting bit in the process. He develops rabies and loses his senses, accusing Janie of cheating on him and poisoning him. He points a gun at her, and she shoots him to save her own life. An all-male, all-white jury finds Janie innocent of murder, and she returns to Eatonville, no longer welcome or comfortable in the Everglades. Phoebe is amazed and inspired by Janie's experiences and leaves her to herself. Janie walks upstairs to her bedroom, the lamp in her hand, like a spark of sun stuff, washing her face in fire. She mourns for Tea Cake and celebrates his life, finally feeling at peace with herself. Their eyes were watching God can be read in lots of different ways. Notably, it can be read through the lens of race, gender, ecology, and lots of others. So I'm going to be focusing on those first three, and then I'll bring in some other interpretations that I think are also kind of fun. So first, race. Their eyes were watching God can be read as a discussion of the historic struggle Black people have faced in trying to free themselves from white oppression. Janie starts out working on a farm in an unbalanced marriage, similar to how Blacks were originally enslaved in North America. Then she becomes a token for Joe Starks to boost his credibility, mirroring the way white people in the 19th century would adopt certain Black people as tokens of their own generosity and social awareness. With Tea Cake, Janie finds relative peace, but it is still, as Donald Marks observes, a peace that is fraught with violence. Her and Tea Cake are, after all, planting and harvesting beans for a wealthy white man. The racism becomes especially clear when Janie and Tea Cake escape the Everglades for Palm Beach, and Tea Cake is forced at gunpoint to bury the dead. White people get coffins, Black people don't, but you can't tell the difference when everyone is so far decayed. Hurston seems to suggest that in times of intense stress, racial tensions also rise. And based on the events of June 2020, she might be right about that. The pandemic correlated with increased racially motivated violence and huge Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, just look at the Google Trends history for racism over the last 20 years. Nothing even comes close to that incredibly tense month, even though the Black Lives Matter movement and related protests began in 2013. The injustices Black people were revolting against didn't just appear overnight, but I really do think the tension caused by a worldwide pandemic pushed everything to a boiling point. It is only once all Janie's men, representatives of white oppression, are gone that her life is freed from violence. In this reading, it makes sense why Janie returns to Eatonville, an all-Black town, rather than her original home. Eatonville is, despite her memories of Joe Stark's oppression, a place of self-governance and freedom for the Black community, where they can learn to manage their internalized racism among themselves without the added pressure of white oppression. There's also the issue of Janie's trial at the end of the book, where she turns to the middle-class white women instead of the Black community in the Everglades for support. After she's found innocent, Hurston writes that the white women cried and stood around Janie like a protecting wall, and the Negroes with heads hung down shuffled out and away. Tea Cake is her link to the Everglades. And without him, Janie is othered, profiled, and dismissed as another example of what Hurston calls the pet Negro system. Their Eyes Were Watching God never seems to break out of a very traditional understanding of romantic relationships and of gender more broadly. After all, one of the first things Hurston does in the book, before even introducing us to Janie, is to emphasize an important difference between men and women. This is the very first thing she says in the book. Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing, until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams knocked to death by time. That is the life of men. Now, women forget all those things they don't want to remember, and remember everything they don't want to forget. The dream is the truth. Then they act and do things accordingly. So Hurston is suggesting that men look to the horizon. Their dream is there, whether it comes true or not. They look at their dreams, whether it's money, power, love, whatever, from a distance. But women's dreams, Hurston suggests, are so strong that they can shape the way women see reality. They live as if their dream has come true, as if they already had whatever they desired, whether that's money, power, fame, love, the same things as men, but up close instead of from a distance. Hurston's distinction between men and women shows that she sees a very, very clear binary, and that this is a woman's story that she is telling, and that is important to her. Janie is not a revolutionary feminist figure. She accepts her primary function as a wife. Her rebellion against gender norms comes not in her refusal to follow the status quo, but in her desire to decide for herself what wifehood looks like. And for Janie Crawford, marriage is defined by love. This was a relatively recent idea. 20 years before Zora Neale Hurston published Their Eyes Were Watching God, the United States had experienced a sexual revolution for women. Victorian-era ideals about women's sexuality, which primarily centered on the idea that women had no sexuality, and if they did, it was really dangerous, were slowly stripped away after women received the right to vote in the United States in 1919. The biggest advancements in women's freedom up until the Second World War were not increased political influence or job opportunities. Those, while they did increase, it wasn't drastic. The biggest increase was in sexual freedom. Birth control was more widely available. Divorce was more accessible. Books on sex and love were increasingly common. And so women were better informed. Christina Simmons explains that advocates of traditional marriage noticed this increased sexual freedom, particularly in upper and middle class women, and repackaged their philosophy about marriage into something they called companionate marriage. Companionate marriage was centered in love and equal admiration between the couple. It is the kind of marriage we see Janie long for throughout the novel. The idea of separate spheres for male and female life was replaced with the dream of full partnership and mutual respect. As Simmons goes on to explain, this dream of companionate marriage was often complicated by the fact that, as much as the situation had improved, men and women were still not equal. There became this great fear that women, instead of accepting an unequal relationship with a man, would enter into lesbian relationships with other women. This isn't a pressing issue in Hurston's book, but it was in the society surrounding her. Men's growing inability to satisfy women, however, does show up in Hurston's book. Janie is consistently disappointed by her marriages. The higher expectations women had for their spouses were a growing anxiety for men who could no longer live up to those expectations. Janie is a complicated character, despite many early scholars considering her a feminist icon of self-discovery and transcendence. There's a lot that Janie does that simply isn't very empowering. For most of the book, she's a passive actor, responding to the actions of her husbands, whether good or bad. Instead of rebelling against Joe's authority, she shuts down, silently complicit in his domination of her. Yes, Tea Cake treats her as more of an equal, but it isn't because she demands equality, but simply because he's a better guy. He just happens to respect her, and she loves him for it. As one critic explains, by the end of the novel, Janie's struggle for identity and self-direction remains stymied. She never defines herself outside the scope of her marital or romantic involvements, and despite her sincere relationship with her friend Phoebe, fails to achieve a communal identification with the Black women around her or with the Black community as a whole. As the novel ends, Janie chooses isolation and contemplation, not solidarity and action. Janie's feminist journey, in that she's independent of men and governs herself, really only starts when the book ends. We have no idea what she will do with her new freedom. Some less optimistic readers even suggest that Janie's life won't last much longer, as the rabid tea cake bit her, and as far as we can tell, she never got a rabies vaccine. But if she is not a feminist icon, why are we celebrating this book? Why did Alice Walker write about Their Eyes Were Watching God, that there was no book more important to me than this one? It speaks to me as no novel, past or present, has ever done. So what makes Their Eyes Were Watching God such an important book if Janie Crawford is just kind of an okay person? Exactly that. Janie is human. She isn't typecasted in the way many Black characters were at the time. She's presented as complex and difficult to understand. She has layers that she keeps hidden from the men she marries, and we can assume as the audience, layers she keeps hidden from us. Most of the book, after all, while written as a record of Janie's life, is narrated by a mysterious omniscient narrator, not Janie. Perhaps the third-person narration is meant to illustrate Janie's growing awareness of herself. She is able to see beyond a first-person perspective of her life and take a more holistic view. The disaster that really makes a deep change in Janie's life is the hurricane. It uproots her, and it's also the source of the title of the book. It is looking into the eye of the hurricane that Janie, if we equate the narrator with Janie, finally feels that her eyes are watching God. As Sarah Ford explains, the storm actually questions any human agency. The chaos overturns basic human attempts to order the world and questions human constructions of reality, from ideas about life, death, and time to concepts such as gender and race. If power comes, as many critics believe it does, through language, through Janie being able to tell her own story, to situate her life as a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end, then the hurricane is what happens when that story breaks down, when we can no longer create a cohesive narrative around our life, when disaster strikes. Nature, as much as we would like it to, does not bend to human logic. The hurricane, then, could represent the limits of our ability to create cohesive stories. Janie sees herself in terms of nature. Black female writers after her, notably Toni Morrison, also saw a connection between Black femininity and trees. Trees are often symbols of fertility and life in African folklore, something Hurston was very familiar with because of her research on the topic. Janie's decision to see herself as a tree with branches and roots, despite having no surviving familial connections by the end of the book, bears testament to the depth of character she has developed within herself. A person, then, is like an ecosystem, like a tree, a complicated web of desires, needs, life, and death all rolled up into one figure. The growth imagery that we see throughout the book of the pear tree, the bean planting and harvesting in the Everglades, and the seeds that Janie carries home with her all suggest that Janie is expanding beyond her present state, that she is experiencing some kind of transcendence. Seeds are interesting because it is not until a plant has grown and is often dying that you see the seed for the next generation appear. A plant has to be fully mature in order to produce seed. Perhaps this is why, despite having 3 different husbands, Janie is never pregnant. She is symbolically being depicted as an immature plant, not yet ripe. Janie does not only not have children, children almost never appear in the book, which is surprising given how many of the themes in Their Eyes Were Watching God center on the fertility of nature and the human spirit. Their Eyes Were Watching God is about development and growth, a growth that, like a seed planted deep in the earth, often looks like stagnation on the surface. How much of change in our lives is just us doing the same thing over and over again until we finally break and do something different? Their Eyes Were Watching God suggests that this period of dumb, repetitive action is actually a kind of germination, and that when a person does grow, it happens all at once. There's so much in Their Eyes Were Watching God that suggests that Janie is the seed. She is planted in the ground early in her life by the farmer, Logan Killix, germinates under the condescending eye of Joe Starks, and finally sprouts through the careful tending and watering of Tea Cake. She is in no position to bear fruit until the end of the book. And it's frustrating to leave her there and wonder, what does she do with the knowledge she has? Does she wrap it around herself like a blanket, using the past to comfort and support her? Or will she use her money, use her influence, and wake up the next day a strong, powerful, and compassionate member of the community? We don't know. Her ascent into the bedroom at the end of the book, where she's holding that light and it's shining off her face, reminds me of the story of Moses, who ascended the mountain, face shining, to talk with God. Moses was a man who was considered so terrifyingly holy, he had his brother Aaron do most of the work with the people to avoid freaking them out. Janie does something similar with Phoebe, telling her to share her story for her. Hurston wrote an entire book as a biography of Moses, called Moses, Man of the Mountain, where she explains in the foreword that in Haiti, the highest god in the Haitian pantheon is Dambala Wedo Wedo Token Freda Dehomi, and he is identified as Moses, the serpent god. Wherever the children of Africa have been scattered by slavery, there is the acceptance of Moses as the fountain of mystic powers. In Moses, Man of the Mountain, Hurston writes this moment near the end of Moses' life. What could he do for Israel that he had not already done? Nothing but live in a palace and wear a crown. He had known palaces, and the shadows of crowns had fallen athwart on his head. He recoiled inwardly and felt cold. No, he didn't want to rule that way. He wanted freedom. He wanted to ask God and nature questions. He wanted to revel in mountains. I see parallels here between Janie and Moses. Both see freedom and rest, not community, as the ultimate goal. They are both at heart individuals, retreating into themselves instead of turning to their communities. Hurston seems to be suggesting that that is the nature of transcendence, that knowledge may be more desirable than company. Tea Cake is completely opposed to this idea. He is always surrounded by people, and Janie suggests that Tea Cake makes friends wherever he goes. His name, Tea Cake, comes from an African-American sweet treat that was shared by the community during the oppression of slavery. Even when he steals Janie's money, his motives are altruistic. He feeds the community with fried chicken and mac and cheese. Tea Cake is arguably everything that makes the community worth being a part of. The music, the talk, the fun. And he makes Janie feel like a full participant in their community in the Everglades. But he's also flighty, addicted to gambling, unserious, and even abuses Janie out of jealousy. Although the narrator treats his abuse more like a form of foreplay, mentioning how jealous all the women are of Tea Cake's extra care and attention afterwards when he didn't even bruise her. It's likely that Zora Neale Hurston borrowed the character of Tea Cake from a real-life younger man who she'd been in love with. This man had urged Hurston to give up her career and marry him. Hurston, heartbroken, refused. While it's often dangerous to read too much into the life of the author, I think it's important to recognize that while Janie might be willing to surrender any direction to the men in her life, her creator, Hurston, was not. This is important because it suggests that Janie's passivity was not simply a blind spot for the author, but an intentional decision on Hurston's part. While Tea Cake may be painted as a lovable scoundrel, he still stands in the way of Janie's full development immersing her in an idyllic but unsustainable Eden in the Everglades. But the fall is always imminent. In order for Janie to reach that full transcendence, she needs to be able to live a life without tea cake, a solitary life outside of the community, where she can reach a higher plane of knowledge. Janie Crawford's story is ultimately ambivalent. So much relies on how you choose to perceive Janie, how you interpret her sacred ascent to her bedroom. But regardless of how you choose to read Their Eyes Were Watching God, it is a story that improves with further reading and further study, that rewards the attentive reader with beautiful language and a heartbreaking story of a resilient woman in a difficult world. I hope you'll take this book down from your shelf every couple of years, dust it off, and continue to be immersed in Janie's life, which is so deeply hers, but which also speaks so directly to our own. If you want more information about Their Eyes Were Watching God, check out my website and subscribe to my email list. I'll be posting on my blog once every couple of weeks with additional resources, other great authors to consider if you enjoyed Hurston's work, and additional, less directly connected research that I couldn't work in here. Thank you so much for watching. Feel free to like, subscribe, and I will see you in a few months with our next